What I'm going to do today is a relatively deep dive on this question of juxtaposing kind of traditional urban infrastructure and how it comes to market and how it's financed with broadly what I'm categorizing as alternative approaches to infrastructure. And I know that there's a huge range of things that, that fall into the bucket of alternative infrastructure, but I'm going to kind of take a slice of that and focus on buildings. And when I talk about buildings, I think you're all intimately familiar with what I mean by buildings as a part of the infrastructure. Kind of with traditional approaches to infrastructure, a building is kind of a passive end user of stuff. You know, electrons coming in, you know, pipes coming in and coming out. But the building is just passive. It's not in any way contributing to the system as a whole. It's just, as I said, a passive end user. And so lots of thinking that has gone into alternative approaches to infrastructure in the built environment have to do with how do you make the building an integral part of the broader infrastructure. So a building could be generating electricity, it could be managing stormwater, it could be doing a whole host of things when in the aggregate, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of buildings, if they're all doing that in the aggregate, it dramatically changes, right, the whole kind of equation of what is infrastructure and what is what traditionally was kind of a centralized source with spokes and wires feeding buildings. So so that's what I'm going to do today with a couple of slides, and if we have time I will go into a few examples on the efficiency side of things. So what this matrix, and I have it a little bit here laid out by different elements, and let me just launch them all up here quickly first. So these are sort of 6 typical things that are considered in financing for infrastructure. The first one is, what type? The second one around ownership, is it publicly or privately owned? Who owns it? The third being, what's the source of repayment? Is it just a general obligation of a jurisdiction, or is it a toll road, or what is the source of money that's going to help cover the repayments? What is the credit quality of the entity that is borrowing the money? Is it a pool? Is it a single entity, or is it a group of entities? And lastly, is it possible to get any sort of guarantee around the performance of the infrastructure? So I actually, I think with some help from WRI, and as you can see, C40, this was done, I don't know, 5 or so years ago, but it actually is really, I think, still quite relevant and helpful. We presented this at a C40 conference in Johannesburg, I guess around that time. And so the idea here is that the bottom band, this light blue band, let's call it business as usual. This would be, as I populate it here, so a single hard facility or system, like a power plant or a sewage treatment plant. That's the type of infrastructure. It's publicly owned. The repayment is a general obligation. The credit quality, it's rated or investment grade and good quality. By credit pool, here I mean single, meaning there's just one borrower, right? Not lots of borrowers. And then, yes, it's possible to get a performance guarantee. So what we did with this chart was we said, okay, this sort of bottom horizontal layer is, again, business as usual. And then what we attempted to do was, okay, if we were to move, as we move to alternative infrastructure, how do each of these attributes change? And so in this chart, the only time that you should read horizontally is this bottom row. And what we've done is we've sort of layered in, moving up in degrees of complexity, what happens as you turn to alternative approaches. And then at the top are some mitigants that we can talk about. So, so a soft system would be something like that's software enabled, like soft parking, right? You have an app that shows you where parking spaces are and reduces the amount of time that cars are running around and giving out emissions and wasting time. Or distributed hard. So this could be green roofs, solar panels, and then lastly, natural systems, things like bioswales. And everything that I'm showing here in terms of a judgment call on complexity and how hard things are to do or to get could be a little bit dated, or you all may have a different view as to whether, how hard it is to kind of achieve these things, or how complex they may or may not be. So you may think bioswales, there's, aren't complex. But these blue bars that I put in, I am implying that you're crossing a hurdle of complexity, at least from a finance point of view. And so here we go, going from public to private, that's not a hurdle. But once you sort of get public and private together, you're just adding more complexity. None of these things are impossible. I'm just saying it's getting more complex, right? The legal docs and the contracts, when you have multiple parties in a deal, it's just getting a little bit more complex. So general obligation, when you get to revenue through tolls, you have a little bit more uncertainty depending upon the performance of the roadway, how it's being utilized. Is it being utilized as was anticipated? And then you have cost savings. So to what extent does the alternative infrastructure deliver the exact same or even better outcomes and do so at a lower cost? And here too, you have, again, a little bit more complexity in terms of certainty around that and how that's managed. Oh, right. These are really important. So secondary benefits, like super important. When I think about energy efficiency in multifamily affordable housing, there's all kinds of ancillary benefits that are taking place. You're improving indoor ambient air quality, and so there's all kinds of secondary benefits like public health. But again, how do we capture those types of benefits in a way that meets the needs of finance? Then we come over to credit quality, and of course, if it's not rated or if it's low quality. Oh, I'm sorry. So here's rated low quality, and then you have non-rated high quality and non-rated low quality. Non-rated high quality, so just to pause on that for a moment, I think these are all self-evident, right? Rated high quality is an investment grade municipality or a corporate. Rated low quality, the opposite of the first. A non-rated high quality, this could be a household, a low and moderate income household who always pays their bills on time. If they were to have a FICO score or a credit rating, it would be perfect, but they've never borrowed, and so they don't have a credit score. So we don't know. And then non-rated low quality, kind of similar. Okay, credit pool. So by this we mean, let's just for a moment pretend we're talking about, actually no, what I'm going to do is use an example after I go through all these. So multiple same type would mean single family homes where the credit is all a household or a FICO score. That would be multiple same type. Multiple of different type would be a basket of borrowers who are, all different types of borrowers: households, small businesses, municipalities. So kind of a mishmash of borrowers. Here, again, getting a performance guarantee. This, I think, is probably a little bit dated because we now do see performance guarantees on distributed systems. So I might take away that blue bar there, and then just, no, you can't get nobody is willing to guarantee the performance, and so that would present a challenge. I'm going to back up here for just a second. Yeah.
Clarifying question, you mentioned the blue bars. I'm sorry, I missed what those represent.
So for me, a blue bar means you are crossing a complexity threshold. So let's take ownership as an example. You see, if it's publicly owned or if it's privately owned, we're agnostic from a finance point of view. Or it's not any more complex, public or private. But a public-private partnership is a little bit more complex than pure public or pure private. And so the blue bar suggests that you are crossing a threshold of complexity. So there's a lot of thresholds of complexity that are, that folks are crossing, setting aside all of the kind of policy things that underpin how we get to sustainable infrastructure, or the technology that we have that gets us there. There's some work to be done on the part of financial institutions and those who are interacting with them to help them, overcome these points of complexity. And I guess the other message that I would say from this chart would be, pick and choose. Like if you had a couple of projects and one had, crossed 6 bars, whereas another project only crossed 2, and you're trying to figure out which one has the most legs for getting financing, it's probably the one with, lower complexity, at least out of the gate, right? As we develop competency and experience with shifting to this market. So I'm going to use an example and walk through each of these really quickly. Let's use stormwater as an example. I know Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, and other cities are under EPA consent decrees. They are pursuing different approaches to addressing stormwater. Rather than building, a bigger box at the end of the pipe, they are trying to address it upstream, right? And so, in column 1, that could be either a distributed system or a natural system. In column 2, it could be a mix of things, right? Because anything that's property-based, we're looking at, so who owns the properties? So the city of DC or Philadelphia could say, okay, we're going to do all this just on the properties that we control, but that may not be enough to meet the requirements of the program. So you have a mix. You have some properties that are public, you have some that are private. The repayment source on stormwater, a portion of it could be cost save. I'm sure there's secondary benefits that would arise. And I believe for revenue, I know Philadelphia is doing this, I'm not sure about DC, but they satellite mapped the city, I think in Philadelphia, and are charging property owners for stormwater based on how much impervious land you have. So if you're a parking lot and it's not pervious asphalt, you're going to be paying more than a property that has a lot more pervious land. Credit quality, it could be all over the map. Again, would depend on the pool of properties that are in your program, right? They could be, they could be any of those in that column. On a credit pool, I think it would be that top box, right? Multiple different type. And on a performance guarantee, I don't know, maybe some of you know, whether or not the companies who are installing bioswales or doing other natural systems to either slow or redirect stormwater, do they provide a performance guarantee? How long is that guarantee for? What happens if the amount of water that they are guaranteeing is going to be redirected or slowed doesn't meet that requirement? Do they, what do they do? What do they do to mitigate that? So, so now I just have a few things that can be done to mitigate. In that first category, I think it's really just a matter of familiarization, and maybe that's a a generational sort of thing. On repayment source, assurance of facility or system use. So when we finance energy efficiency in a building, improvements for energy efficiency, there are two categories of questions on the finance side that we're asking. One is around performance, which I was just speaking to, and the other is around whether or not the building is going to be an ongoing viable concern such that there's actually somebody turning on the lights every day using energy and saving energy. And so it's a little bit of an occupancy question. And so there are a few ways that we can get comfort around assurance of facility use. So for example, in multifamily affordable housing in New York City, there are long lists of folks who are waiting for those units. So there are ways such as that, right? Maybe city agencies or others who can say, we have a high degree of certainty that there will be somebody in this unit saving the energy, realizing the energy savings that you are financing. On credit quality, it's the sort of standard credit enhancement, right, for weaker or unknown credits. In a credit pool, size and diversity can certainly help. And then on the performance guarantee side of things, I think another way to mitigate risk is, so let's just say it's going back to stormwater, and there are 20 measures that a city is going to roll out and implement, versus, and maybe those 20 get you to 100%, but 3 of them get you to 80%. Maybe you just go with the 3 to get to the 80 because it's easier to, get some assurance or certainty around the performance of a smaller number, at least out of the gate. How many of you are familiar with power purchase agreements, a PPA for solar? A PPA, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is a way that a property owner can have a distributed generating asset like solar put on its property without outlaying any capital. So you want solar, you don't want to use your money to put it on the building, and so a third party says, I'll do it, I'll come, I'll install it, it won't cost you anything, you'll enter into a power purchase agreement with me, and I will charge you for a fixed price for each unit of energy generated by that asset at a discount to the utility. So you're getting a reduced utility bill, you're getting solar, and the life of the contract is how long it takes to amortize down and pay off the equipment. There is an efficiency version of this called either an efficiency services agreement or an energy services agreement. That's what this diagram is, which ties back in a lot of ways to the previous chart, which I'll explain in just a moment. Under an efficiency services agreement, it's the exact same scenario. You're a property owner or a lessee. You're in a building with old lighting, old old management systems, old HVAC. You don't have money to change it, or you don't want to use your money to change it. So a third party comes in and does all of that. And instead of charging you a fixed price per each unit of energy generated, it's charging you a fixed price per each unit of energy saved. Okay? And so let's just start with this bottom chart for a moment. So historically, you are in those full blue bars. You're using, my eyesight's horrible here. You're using 100 units of energy a month over here in 2016. You're paying the utility $1 per unit for each unit of energy. And so here you are, $100 a month. Enter the ESA, and the ESA says, okay, I'm going to save you 40 units of energy a month. So in 2018, every month you're spending $60. You're using 60 units of energy, and you're paying $60 to the utility. And your efficiency utility, which I'll describe in a moment, is charging you for those 40 units of energy saved by virtue of the new stuff. And they're charging you at a discount to what you were paying the utility. So maybe 90 cents on the dollar. So you, property owner or lessee, get new stuff. You are paying a reduced utility bill, and it's pay for performance. If it doesn't perform, you don't pay. You're only paying for units of energy that are saved. And how do you know what's saved? There is a baseline that is agreed upon in the contract, and then there's a monitoring and verification protocol for all of you who are like into monitoring and verification. M&V now is like essential to the financing here. The sensors, the protocols around M&V now become like a critical piece of the financing, because unless I can show that by virtue of the stuff that I put in the building, that's why I'm saving you those 40 units. If I can't prove that to you, how am I going to charge you for it? So I'm going to get to your question around the performance guarantee in just a moment here. So just coming to the structure now of this, I think many of you may be familiar with energy performance contracting, right? This is what ESCOs do. An energy performance contract is a component of this model. It's this piece right here. What energy services companies tend not to want to do today, they don't want to be in the finance business, and they don't want to be in the ownership business. So usually, I wish I had a diagram for this, but it's pretty simple. Usually what happens in a traditional energy performance contract is this box disappears, and there is a energy performance contract between an ESCO and a host. We use the word host to describe properties. And there's a guarantee between host and ESCO. And then the host finds financing. The financing is completely separate from this relationship in a traditional energy performance contract. The financer only cares about the credit quality of the host and whether or not they're going to be able to repay. The finance may look at the terms of the energy performance contract. So if energy performance contract says you're going to save $100 a month, lender could structure the term of the financing to take that into consideration. However, if energy services company doesn't perform, host pays no matter what in that model. Lenders, I'm sorry, don't care about the performance. They're out of the performance equation. It's between the host and the ESCO to resolve any disparities, any performance issues. In this model, you now have finance taking performance risk. So there's a few differences in this model than there are in a traditional energy services, energy performance contracts. So that's one, and I'll show how we're taking that risk. So in this instance, what you have is an intermediary who, again, approaches a host, a property owner, and says, or the host approaches them, or the ESCO. Usually there's different ways that these get originated, but essentially the host wants to make these changes, wants to do so on an off-balance sheet basement on a services arrangement, doesn't want to have to use any of its own capital, doesn't want to enter into a capital lease, and only wants to pay for performance, right? It's true pay for performance. So in this model, a third party comes in the middle here, you can see that, and that third party enters into two contracts. It enters into the contract with the ESCO, not the host. So it's entering into that contract. And then it's entering into a separate contract with the host, essentially saying, host, you're only going to pay, you're only going to pay for units of energy saved. And so again, this accomplishes a few things. It accomplishes a few important things for the host. It doesn't require the host to put up any money. The host is only paying for performance. Now, coming back to your question about where does a performance guarantee come in to this? So in this model, you have equity and debt up above here. If the energy services company performs as guaranteed, the host is obligated to pay. So in that instance, if the host decides not to pay me, I'm exposed to the host. And that's why the credit quality of the host is very important to me. If the ESCO doesn't perform, host is not obligated to pay, and now I care about the host, the ESCO, and I care about the guarantee that it's providing, and I care about the company that stands behind that guarantee. Is it investment grade? What's its track record for performance? How many times has it had to go ahead and distribute monies because it failed to perform? And so now when you go back here, if you think about 10,000 bioswales around Washington, D.C., and I'm lending on a performance basis because the city is only going to pay for gallons of water diverted or slowed. I care a lot about who built those bioswales. Is it a startup that could just disappear tomorrow, or have they been around for a while? I care about the guarantee, and I care about the credit quality of them as well. And so you can see kind of incrementally what's happening here on these deals for certain technologies like LED lighting. We have a lot of data on how LED lighting performs. There are a lot of companies who may be somewhere in between, let's say, a startup and a GE, who are maybe 5 years old, but who have enough of a track record that would give us comfort. And you have independent engineers now who will, provide that sort of third-party validation. So there is, I think, incremental progress that's being made, as we, on the finance side of this equation, as we transition away from building bigger stormwater or sewage treatment plants to, figuring out how to slow the flow or redirect it. But you can see there are a lot of hurdles that have to be crossed to move you away and to move finance and to get finance comfortable with moving away from business as usual to a large program that would put the big box at the end of the pipe on equal footing with I'm just making it up, 10,000 bioswales, right? Comments or questions?
I have one on the infrastructure type. You've identified market socialization as the main mitigant.
Yes.
I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit more, because I mean, the actual physical characteristics of these infrastructure in some cases are so different.
Yes.
And how we would even understand their performance is so different.
Yes.
Is it just a matter of the investor understanding it, or do they need different data? Are there
Right.
What goes into market socialization?
Yeah, that's a good question. And maybe you all have some ideas on this. I mean, I think it's literally, engineering students who graduated in the 50s and 60s who all they learned, if they were in the stormwater business, all they knew and learned about were building plants. Now, I'm guessing if you go to an engineering program, alternative types of infrastructure are being introduced, and there's familiarity, and so I think there's multiple levels of socialization that's taking place, and some of that has to do with kind of the skills needed to implement and execute a program of commensurate that can deliver the same objective, right, that a stormwater plant and reconfiguring the urban landscape can do. So it's kind of skills, it's comfort with performance, it's there's a lot of policy aspects to this. I don't know how many of you are familiar with what DC and Philadelphia and other cities are doing on this point, but it's some of it is policy driven, like the comment I made about how they're charging property owners, right? So in theory there's going to be over time an incentive for property owners to want to decrease the cost they're paying for using the stormwater infrastructure. And so it could be anything from literally a rain barrel, which just slows the flow, like a $20 rain barrel or something at the end of your gutter, to putting greening your roof, changing your driveway from impervious asphalt to pervious asphalt. So there are kind of introductions of behavior and technology. And I think another important piece on this is just what a big difference it is thinking about this from a fixed point piece of equipment to like hugely distributed, various types of equipment. Everything from a bucket, literally a bucket at the end of a gutter, to, new paving materials, green roofs. What does it take to do a green roof? What building code implications are there of putting, a green roof on a house in terms of was the roof designed to support the added weight? And right, so you can imagine, right? It's like a bunch of stuff that has to adjust.
Do you think like geographic proclivity to natural disasters falls in, because that is like an added risk and
yes,
kind of another degree of complexity?
Yes, on both the good side and the bad side. So you can imagine, if I understand your comment correctly, there might be jurisdictions where certain approaches to infrastructure could have an added value of being more resilient to natural disasters, and therefore there's another layer of benefit or secondary benefit that should be incorporated. And maybe that's manifest in insurance. Maybe in that example, the insurance costs of the stormwater plant that's at the end of the pipe and is located on the river, maybe the insurance costs for that plant are going up because it keeps getting battered by storms. And so in that instance, when you are comparing the costs of those two approaches, you've got here now yet another benefit to something like that. Is that what you're...
Yeah, no, it's interesting you flipped it. I wasn't really thinking of it on that I was thinking of it more in terms of like risk from the financial point of view,
Right.
if the infrastructure is getting so battered by natural disasters,
Right.
like how does that fall in? But yes, it also is a benefit in terms
Right.
of reducing existing.
But you're right. So we would care. Let's say we're a lender to. Let's say, bondholders or lenders to that stormwater plant, which is a 20 or 30-year bond, anticipated certain costs for running that plant, and now that cost pattern is changing because of insurance costs or having to raise it or buttress it or something like that. That could have a direct bearing in that repayment source column. I don't have a lot of experience on this topic outside of the U.S., but I would say maybe certain of these categories get harder depending upon what the geography is and the credit quality and whether there are entities willing to provide guarantees in those locations in the same way that they're willing to provide guarantees, here or in other more developed economies. So, but in general, I'd say yes, and maybe just all of it a little bit harder. Maybe that's presumptuous. I don't know. Maybe I'd have to think about that. Maybe there are certain locations where some of these things get easier because, in a sense, one of the things that we're saying on stormwater is kind of like an undevelopment, right? It's like we built cities with a certain amount of pavement and an assumption that we can manage all the water that's going to flow into this box. And now we're getting more intense rainstorms, and that box is getting overwhelmed. And so we're actually unbuilding, right? We're like pulling out pavement or making it more pervious. And so, kind of like how certain markets have leapfrogged landlines and just gone to mobile technology, maybe there's a way to think about this where they can avoid, certain places maybe they can avoid some of the approaches to infrastructure that had assumptions built into them that there'll never be rain intensity that the box at the end of the pipe can't manage. Oh, but now there is.
On the energy service agreement models, I'm just curious, is that typically a fixed cost agreement where the host will have a specific price that they're sort of in that bottom box? It sort of makes it look like the host has an agreement that says they will pay 60 and then the service provider is taking on the rest of the risk. But are there agreements where that's a percentage? For instance, speaking to the developing country question, if it's a market that has a really volatile energy price,
right?
Who would typically be bearing the risk if?
That's a great question. So we do, in this case, you are locking in a rate, and so you are hedged against volatility on. You're paying on a unit basis. So that I guess depending upon what the contract is and whether you could, if rates were to go up, right? In this model, if utility rates go up, then then you're in good shape because you're entering into a contract at a fixed price per unit of energy saved. I guess a risk could be if rates fell dramatically, then you would be paying more for efficiency than you would be for units of energy generated. I'm going to jump to this slide. Okay, yes, I'm just checking on time here. So I had a flat tire about 2 weeks ago, and the dealer where I got my car is in a neighborhood of Brooklyn where my mother grew up. So I was like, I'm going to go see my mother's apartment building. My childhood memories of visiting this apartment were showing up there for the holidays, and it's the middle of the winter, and you open the door and you're blasted by hot air, and the combination of the heat and it would be like turkey dinner. So it's, what is it, the tryptophan or whatever that drug is in turkey that makes you tired, like those two, and it was like everyone was just totally passed out in the middle of the winter. Simple technology fixes, right? There was a single thermostat for this entire building, and it keeps going this way. Anyway, so I just went back for kicks. I went back to check out the building, and I was like so struck by the fact that this was 60 years ago she was there. I could tell that some of the windows had not been changed in 60 years. But the other thing that struck me was that some of them had. So like here's a building where we talk about like we've got to move faster than just building by building, but here's an example where the building it's actually unit by unit. Like the unit decided, okay, we're going to change our windows. You can see there's like 3 or 4 different types of windows on this building. So I only bring this up to make the point that to get where we need to get to, we have to figure out how to, in these alternative approaches, how to really efficiently aggregate and get to scale. And so now, let me back up here a little bit. I like to juxtapose the efficiency opportunity to how oil and gas is explored for and produced. In oil and gas, you have a sovereign entity who has domain over blocks that they auction off. And that sovereign isn't asking anybody to put up, that sovereign is not expected to finance it, right? They put out an auction, and there are hydrocarbon explorers and producers who gladly say, just give us access to this property and we'll take over from there, right? And they've had their experts, their geologists and others who've done their analysis of the properties and what they expect that they can, harvest from there. So, what do we have on the efficiency side of things, right? How do we create similar opportunities for an efficiency explorer and producer who can get access to a similar type of opportunity? And here is an example of how it almost, in the United States, I shouldn't assume, maybe there are certain countries around the world, and we're going back to somebody else's question about how things work in different geographies. If one entity controlled these blocks and could say to a Johnson Controls or a Honeywell or whoever, here you go, I am giving you license to go explore and produce efficiency. And they would not need a high-tech person to walk by my mother's building and see windows wide open in the middle of winter. They would very quickly, with all kinds of new technology that folks are using, heat maps and the like, to be able to say, okay, I'm going to bid on this block and I'm going to go, have at it. The problem is here in the United States, those blocks are comprised of, going back to my first chart, properties, all different types of properties with different ownership structures requiring different measures. And so then I think the onus on all of us is to say, how do we think about blocks, maybe in a non-contiguous basis, that can afford us, similar opportunities as those in the Gulf of Mexico? And so in that instance, I think to myself, what would be an example of that? And I'm just making up names here. Let's say InBev has 1,000 bottling plants around the globe. And they have a pretty good idea on the operating performance of those bottling plants. it's difficult for entities like ourselves to be able to touch those 1,000 bottling plants because they're owned by maybe local businesses or local LLC that is hard for us to bank from a credit perspective. But a company like InBev or Coke or whoever could look across that landscape of 1,000 bottling plants and say to themselves, let's see here. They could say to themselves, this is the 1,000. The host is now the bottling plants, and here you have InBev, and just ignore this stuff here. But here's InBev, and InBev could say, okay, the real risk here that I'm evaluating as a lender is what is the likelihood that this entity is going to be capable of paying the equivalent or less than of its utility bill for the life of my project, for the life of my contract. That's the risk, right? That's essentially what we're asking ourselves, right? Will that property be an ongoing viable concern? Will it be occupied? Will it be operating such that it's going to be capable of paying its utility bill? Because that's what we are modeling, that's what we are guaranteeing in a construct like this. So who's better positioned to answer that question? And I have it written out here. Who's better positioned to answer that question for those 1,000 bottling plants? So maybe InBev says, okay, I have a 95% confidence that 60% of my bottling plants, the ones that I use, the ones that are bottling my beer, are gonna be viable, ongoing concerns for the next 6 years. And based on that, I will guarantee those payments for them. Once I have something like that, a guarantee like that, I can then, that's something that I can bank because I have an entity that I understand the credit of and can bank. But going back to this kind of block notion, I would fall on my sword for someone to say to me and the companies I work with, here are 600 bottling plants, just like the Bureau of Land Management does for Exxon and Chevron. Here's, bid on this block, go have at it. Let me have access to those 600 bottling plants in one fell swoop. And you can imagine or think of lots of other iterations of that, not just for energy, but for water or for stormwater, anything that's property-based. Who is in a position to be able to opine on that question of, are they going to be there capable of paying their bill? And as I alluded to earlier in my comments about multifamily affordable housing in New York, and there are kind of structural reasons why this doesn't happen, kind of going back to this, some bureaucratic structural reasons why it's difficult for somebody to step in as guarantor, but it is implausible to think that any unit of affordable housing in San Francisco or in New York is going to go unoccupied. It's just the demand is, way outpaces supply. And so figuring out, okay, if we know that, who is in a position, just like InBev on the bottling plants, who is in a position to be able to make that determination and stand behind it? And what I would say is there are, probably a dozen or so iterations of this that we can think of, franchises, managed properties, supply chain, sort of a whole host of ways that we can go farther than I'm able to go with this, because I can only go to investment grade here. So like my universe of properties, who I'm able to finance today, is investment grade corporates. And we need to be able to touch way more than investment grade corporates for any sort of alternative infrastructure, whether it's energy or stormwater, waste.
So, two things. You're describing this from a commercial lender perspective, right? All these, many of these entities say, we need finance to be able to do this. And you say, well, here are the conditions under which we can finance it. And that's what this is about in part, right?
Yeah.
To get more of private sector, commercial finance engaged. And then on the guarantee, what's being guaranteed in this model is something different, right? An ESCO guarantees the savings, the performance of the equipment.
Yes.
But the primary thing that you're looking for the guarantee for is
payment.
Essentially the cash flow or the viability of the business or the property that's being invested in over a longer period of time, right?
Can it pay its utility bill? Can it pay the equivalent or less than of its historic utility bill? And so when I am evaluating that risk for an investment grade corporate, I am in part relying on the fact of their credit quality, but I'm also, partly asking myself, what's the likelihood that, just making up a name, Walmart is going to be in that location, for the next 5 years? It's a pretty good likelihood that they are. Or on a portfolio basis, if it's 60 or 100 Walmarts, okay, so 90% of them, they're going to be in that location, and Walmart is comfortable with, if they have to move out of a few of those locations, they understand that risk and they can handle breaking the contract or moving the contract or what have you. So you're absolutely right. Here, Johnson Controls is providing a guarantee on the performance. But perhaps for us, for the lender, the bigger question, because I have a high degree of confidence in them and their track record, the bigger question for me is on InBev's, on the bottling plant that InBev uses in Lagos, Nigeria. I have no idea whether they're going to be there for the next 5 years, or maybe InBev's going to decide to switch to another one. That's why I would look to an InBev, or I would look to a McDonald's as a franchise manager or franchisor. Sorry.
You said specifically corporates. What about
public sector?
Public sector,
yes.
Cities or national governments?
Same. Universities, hospitals, any entity that that we have comfort with the credit quality. On public sector, and Clay may know better, or others may know better than I do, they may have better opportunities to finance using tax-exempt mechanisms that are different than this. I'm not sure if we've thought about combining tax-exempt with this.
Thanks. Maybe one final question. What do you see as the barrier? Have you had conversations with
Yes.
companies,
Yes.
Public sector?
Public sector?
Are there big, what are the big barriers you've seen so far, or are there things in the works that you see as promising?
So I think there are a few things for me that are promising about this space. One is just the fact that information management systems and energy management systems are allowing for enterprises to understand things on a global level, and that gets elevated. So just data and knowledge of where the opportunities are and how do we make use of them. We've applied this on a programmatic basis with companies where they are looking at their footprint, let's say across the United States, and they're picking off properties where the economics are weak because of utility rates or because of weather, and they're using sites around the country where the economics are strong, and they're putting them together, and they're ending up with a program that works for them. I would say that it appears as though, at least in the corporate space, there's some movement away from, or like folks have kind of done some pilots using approaches like this or other types of approaches and are now, having socialized and getting comfortable taking a programmatic approach and growing. I see lots of kind of like $500,000, $250,000-ish opportunities out there that are hard for us to touch. So I really need, for me to succeed, for the companies that I work with to succeed, like we have to have programmatic approaches.
Well, thanks so much, Bruce. Really
My
appreciate
pleasure.
you
Yeah,
taking the
thank
time.
you. Thanks.